It's my pleasure now to introduce the next panel, National Security in Cyberspace in a Post-Snowden Era. The panel will be moderated by General Mike Hayden. I'll remind everybody that you should have copies of the bios for all the panelists, along with the agenda. This panel will explore the workings of the NSA and how they balance privacy and security, how Europe looks at our issues as well as their own, if we can rebuild trust internationally and the impact of American competitiveness, as well as how we rebuild trust in the U.S. between citizens, industry, and government. Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Catherine. Good afternoon. Welcome all. I think we've got a very interesting discussion in front of us here today. Let me make just a few introductory remarks, kind of how I think we size the issue. And let me begin with the comment that the controversies that Catherine suggested we now must address and deal with were things, I think, less created or less caused by Mr. Snowden and his revelations than they might have been revealed by his revelations, in terms of he revealed a lack of consensus that perhaps had been assumed but did not genuinely exist. And so he's more effect than cause, but nonetheless, that lack of consensus laid bare now presents a pretty significant work program for those interested in both security and liberty. I think he demonstrated the final fraying here in the United States of that post 9/11 consensus on terrorism and security policy. I think he laid bare, and what followed after him, laid bare the reality and the implications of a shifting cultural understanding of what constitutes legitimate privacy and legitimate transparency. Again, nothing he created, but certainly reflects. I think he tore the veil off of a pre-existing divergence in values and views on security that have been growing between the United States and Europe. I'm struck by one comment in Der Spiegel early last fall at the height of the revelations, where one German commentator said that we always thought that there were two Americas, that there was a better America. Now we know there is just one America. Again, reflecting a divergence in long-term views. And then finally, I think what he's revealed, and really the debates that have followed that, have showed the stress in companies that were at the same time national and international, and the stress those companies have to go through with that dual identity as to how do they respond to the lawful request for information in countries where they might be located, and how do they do that in a way that sustains their truly internationalist credentials. So an awful lot going on, and we've got a great panel to discuss it. I will very briefly introduce them because I know you've got the bios in your kits. Chris Inglis, former Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, just recently retired. Chris was working there when I was there. He served the country in the United Kingdom, also served the United States in the United States Air Force as a Brigadier General in the Air Force Reserve. Hallie Tilmer-Clark, Head of Cyber Policy Coordination, Conflict Prevention, and Security Policy Directorate, the European External Action Service, a very long title. What you need to know about Hallie was she was the one sweeping up the pieces after the Russian cyber attack on the Estonian internet system in 2007. Scott Charney, Corporate Vice President, Trustworthy Computing, Microsoft. In addition to the work he's now doing in the private sector, Scott has a rich background in history and experience inside the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section. And then finally, Rear Admiral Mike Brown, Vice President, General Manager, RSA Global Public Sector, more than 31 years in the United States Navy, and his last official government job was Director of Cybersecurity Coordination for the Department of Homeland Security. So I think we've got a very, very good mix-up here. So much for teeing things up and introductions. Let's move right on to the discussion. Chris, I said I would start with you and something along the lines of, what were you guys doing out there? And what did you think was the appropriate balance between security and policy in carrying out your assigned mission?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's a great framing. A year ago, I would have asked who in the room knows what NSA is. Now you all know what NSA is, but perhaps you have some misperceptions about what the reality of that is. I'd like to walk through what an NSA framing would be on the balance between security and privacy, how it achieves that. And in so doing, make some comparisons and contrasts, but mostly some comparisons to a European model. I think Helly will give some much more authoritative insights to that. But I'd like to recommend that we're not so far apart, right? That these things are not simply reconcilable, that they start largely from the same premise, though they talk about it in different terms. At NSA, the discussion over the last 9 months that has been roiling in and across the landscape is the balance between security and privacy. And at the end of that question is, for whom? I think we started with an ardent defense in June of 2013 in the face of these allegations about the prospect that we actually have a reasonable balance between security and privacy for U.S. citizens, for U.S. persons. I think the extension of that is, what about innocence abroad? Would say that NSA's controls essentially start from the premise laid in by the Constitution that our own people have specially attributed rights and privileges, that if you're a U.S. person by virtue of either your citizenship status or where you live or where you're incorporated, that first and foremost that the government essentially only operates with your consent, and that you only therefore are subject to those things that are explicitly granted to the government. That drives NSA as well as the rest of the federal bureaucracy to essentially think of its authorities the following way. If there's an explicitly granted authority, in NSA's case for foreign intelligence, then we can execute that authority. If it's not explicitly granted, then we cannot. We cannot get up in the morning and essentially say, I want to go collect X for my own purposes, for my own interest, or for my own discretion, and therefore riffle through that and possibly come up with some things that are interesting, and at the end of the day, call that intelligence. So it has to start with an explicitly granted authority. It also has to comport with the explicitly stated priorities of the administration. Those priorities are essentially the ones you would imagine. We've talked a lot about counterterrorism, counterproliferation, weapons of mass destruction, rogue nations. The things that are on that list are the things that would not surprise you. And there are a few adversaries on there, or potential adversaries, that might equate to nation states, but not many. At the end of the day, authorities, priorities, an explicit grant, an explicit statement of those is what essentially drives NSA. And the way that it then achieves the mix of privacy and national security is to essentially comport itself explicitly with what those authorities and priorities state. Now, a European model is often described as being somewhat different, and I'll defer to Helly in terms of the authoritative statement in this regard. But my view is that while the Europeans talk about necessity and proportionality in the European Human Rights Convention, Article 8, that essentially is roughly similar to what the United States is doing. It comes to the same place by saying that there is room in the world for both national security and the defense of privacy, the defense of civil liberties, that one may necessarily encroach upon the other, and that you have to achieve some balance based upon a thoughtful consideration of how necessary is it for one to encroach upon the other, and how do you do that in proportion to that necessity. The United States, again, uses different terms, but it gets to the same place. Right? The authorities essentially describe the necessity, and the priorities describe the proportionality, right? The least intrusive, the most efficient means by which to achieve the national security end. So that at the end of the day, the kind of contrast between privacy and national security is not altogether different from a European or an American lens. I think what's been missing in this is the third component, the triad, is not complete unless you're talking about transparency. Do we discuss these such that up front we have an understanding of how we've tried to achieve the balance between privacy and security? Do we have sufficient transparency that we essentially operate in the United States with the consent of the governed or those who stand in the shoes of those who are governed? That's really the thing that's changing dramatically over the last 9 months, a much more public discussion about what are the security means and methods, what are the privacy guarantees that are brought to bear, attended to those, how do we in the United States achieve necessity and proportionality in the execution of this mission. I would also make the following observations on the way forward, right, that oftentimes NSA is talked about as an instrument solely of national power. It's a foreign intelligence organization. It's not the only one in the United States, but it's the one that's focused on this domain of interest, cyberspace. But more often than not, NSA's produce, the things that it delivers, are shared not simply with the United States policymakers, but more broadly with coalitions of nations, multiple coalitions that the United States is allied with. And almost always, if there's a threat to another nation on the planet, and NSA has come upon that and has some unique information to contribute, that makes its way to that nation. We talked across the summer about 54 terrorist plots that had been disrupted through some combination of what we know as the 702 authority under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's what other nations might call lawful intercept, and the combination of the collection of the telephone metadata, 54 plots. Turns out only 13 of those actually had a nexus within the United States. The other 41 of those had a nexus that came to ground somewhere else in the world. 25 of those were in Europe. And all of those plots were ultimately disrupted through a combination of national and international means, but NSA's contributions were not trivial. In some cases, NSA's contributions were unique. So the way forward, in my view, would be, I think, the following. Some of this has already been suggested in earlier talks and panels. But first and foremost, a dialogue that defines norms. What are the chalk lines for necessity and proportionality? Michael Daniels suggested a few of those today. Might be that we make a declaration that an organization like NSA does not do economic intelligence for the benefit of the private sector, that we don't get involved in things that would disturb the integrity and resilience of the financial sector. That it's especially important to gauge what the contributions might be to coalitions as a primary good, right? Having described those then as chalk lines or preferences, we begin to then lay on this the possibility that this might be used to international benefit, not simply a national benefit. Two, collaboration, physical collaboration, intimate collaboration between and amongst intelligence services like NSA and their counterparts that increases the white space and reduces the gray space. State-to-state dialogues, possibly aided and abetted by State Department and its counterparts, but ultimately that require or compel some operational collaboration on the traditional issues like counterterrorism or the transfer of weapons of mass destruction, but increasingly on cyber issues as well. That then leads to the possibility that there might be some greater deterrence such that we're not so much solving problems, but we're preventing problems in this space. And that then might lead to the possibility that attribution and norms definition and the preference for collective action deters negative action in this space and makes it such that cyberspace is operating more for good than for naught. The third component, not independent of my other activities, is that transparency should be seen as a primary good. That when we talk about achieving the right balance between privacy and security, you always have to throw in that third pillar of the stool, the third leg of the stool, which is transparency. Absent that, people don't have enough confidence in the first two or the balance between the first two to know that they should or shouldn't sign up to that. Mike.
Chris, thank you very much. Helly, I know you'll react to that in your comments and in our generalized discussion, but how does Europe look at this? And could you give us a sense how genuinely surprising to Europeans were the Snowden revelations, and how aware are Europeans of what their own nations do when it comes to espionage and what they think of that?
Well, thanks for this opportunity to present the EU views on here at this venue. And I think this was a very good start that Chris just presented. We are not so far apart from each other. That's something that actually is also a recognition from our side. Of course, the issue of trust remains important. And we are very happy that since last July, when the Snowden revelations came up, there has been a very productive process towards rebuilding this transatlantic trust when it comes to data protection and privacy issues. The lines that we usually say here would be that Obama's speech in January was a very good step in the right direction. And President Obama's remarks and actions show that the legitimate concerns expressed by the EU have been listened by our US counterparts, and the intensive transatlantic dialogue on these issues has been genuine and has already produced results. It's particularly welcome that there is a willingness to extend safeguards currently available to US citizens as regards to data collection for national security purposes to US citizens. And the President's remarks also opened the way for discussion between the EU and US on a more efficient use of mutual legal assistance treaties and on the data protection norms that should apply to the use of big data. There are a number of questions that still remain open and will need to be addressed in more detail. And dialogue will continue on particularly two topics. First, an improvement of the safe harbor scheme that would address security issues in a way that strengthens trust in transatlantic data transfers in the commercial sector. And the second, a swift conclusion of an umbrella agreement on data protection in the area of law enforcement that will guarantee enforceable rights for EU citizens. As you might know, there was a working group established in July last year. It's called Ad Hoc EU-US Working Group on Data Protection. And it's been a very constructive engagement on those issues. In November, the EU produced the communication on how to rebuild trust in EU-US data flows. And this communication outlines very specific steps how this can be done. First element would be rapid adoption of the EU's own data protection reform with clear rules that are enforceable also in situations when data is transferred and processed abroad. Secondly, addressing European concerns in the ongoing US review process by extending the safeguards available to US citizens to EU citizens, that's I already said. Third, strengthening the protection of data in the commercial sector, safe harbor scheme. Fourth, strengthening data protection safeguards in the law enforcement area. And fifth, promoting privacy standards internationally without compromising the freedom and openness of the internet. And so these would be the very tangible next steps that will be done within the EU-US working group and this, in agreeing on those specific issues that I just outlined. To answer the second question, how the EU citizens have looked at the Snowden revelations and what the different countries are doing in this respect. I think it depends who you ask, as always. If you ask people who are dealing with national security defense issues, then possibly this was no surprise for them, yes. But there are other groups in society that are quite far from this paradigm. And in general, I would think that Europeans, because of history and because of many historical events, some of them just concluded quite recently. So IPO was brought up in the Soviet Union, for instance. For all these reasons, many people still remember the societies that had been spying on their own people. And because of these sensitivities, maybe the reaction sometimes also comes from the background of historical events. So there are many groups and there are many reactions. But when you look at the different systems in EU member states, how the data collection is done, I think we have one exemplary country in the European Union where there was genuine public debate on data collection, and the public actually agreed to a law that allows the intelligence services to have quite wide-reaching rights in this respect, and this is Sweden. And I think the Swedish example is one of the few, and the Swedish example has also maybe set a very high model for other EU member states, which haven't gone through that very open debate. And Sweden is one of the most freedom-loving countries in the world, I believe, and yet the data intelligence, data collection there is at a very high level in its professionality, and the citizens are consulted on this issue. So possibly this is something that some other countries in the EU have to go through, but as the national security issues in the European Union are belonging to the member states, not the EU institutions. So we are not commenting on national security standards officially as EU officials. So we are giving our let's say, lines on data protection and the competencies that EU actually has under its legal basis. But I would like to maybe draw, as a conclusion, attention to two other quite important issues here. First, harmonizing understanding what actually is a good way to go forward, and maybe some sort of to present some sort of more unified transatlantic view on privacy data protection issues is absolutely necessary for economic reasons. And we have seen the companies complaining, suffering, and not maybe having the same revenue or even losing markets because of this Snowden revelations. And therefore, one of the very productive, positive ways to look to the future is to make sure that the future umbrella agreement on data protection actually is agreeable for the both sides and also benefits our common economic interests, especially in the background of the most important transatlantic debate ever now, which is the trade agreement. And therefore, I would think that our small storm on intelligence data collection actually has served a very positive purpose of setting this issue right in the future when we look at the trade and investment partnership. And the second notion would be that more intensive dialogue amongst the allies was maybe also long overdue, especially in the light of some other authoritarian countries that do not need this discussion on how lawfully we can collect data or what exactly is the subject of the surveillance program. And for this latter reason, I would think we really need to reconcile very quickly and make sure that we are, as Obama said in his speech, that we are held to a different standard, exactly because we defend the personal privacy and human dignity. And therefore, I think we are on a very good track now, having a common view here and having a good counterbalance to those regimes that we do not like so much and that do not need these kind of standards. So, thanks.
Thank you. Scott, Ellie's already brought up the economic impact of this, and I'm sure more than once in the last 9 months, you and Microsoft in general felt you were kind of innocent bystanders at a particularly ugly event. So how does this affect American competitiveness? How do you think firms like yours are now viewed, and where do you go from here?
So I'd say a couple of things. Clearly, some of the allegations cause customers concerns, and of course, often those allegations aren't true. If you remember the initial reporting, it was that the government had direct access to the servers of the large IT companies. That turned out, of course, not to be true. You see allegations about backdoors in products. But before I talk about that, I actually want to put this in some context, because if you think about the panels we saw this morning, it was a lot about national strategies to secure cyberspace and what governments can do to make sure that there's trust. And then you learn about government surveillance programs that actually causes people to say we can't trust the technology, and we need to kind of look at this together. So it's important to understand governments have 4 distinct roles with regard to the internet. First of all, they're large users of the internet. They have big IT systems. Their customers are citizens, but they offer all sorts of things online: healthcare, tax filing, government services, and the like. The second, and so like any big enterprise, they need to protect their IT. Second, they're a protector of the internet and the people who use it. And they want to protect the security and privacy of end users, and they want to protect critical infrastructures. Third, they're exploiters of the internet. They attack each other. They take advantages of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. Stuxnet, which affected the Iranian nuclear facility, leveraged 4 0 days in Windows. A 0 day is a vulnerability the vendor is not aware of. And the interesting thing about cyber, which changes so many old paradigms, is when governments use these exploits, they don't remain confined to the government. They're found by researchers, variants are built, and eventually we issued patches for 4 0 days, and the whole world had to deploy them. So what's the implications and cost of that? And in addition to being a user, a protector, and exploiter, they want access to data. Governments have a traditional function of protecting public safety and national security, and therefore they want access to data. And many of these things, when you think about their role as exploiters or their roles of access to data, there's a nationalistic overtone to it. They're protecting their country against evil, sometimes working with partners. But it's interesting that when these revelations first came out, what was the initial, almost visceral government response? Don't worry, there are protections for Americans. But most of my customers are overseas. This does not give them great comfort, right? And so as a global business, what ends up happening is you have customers coming to you and saying, are you complicit in this? What are you doing? The interesting thing was I was never worried about the revelations because Microsoft, for the last decade, a little longer that I've been there, we've always been very principled about what we've done. We have 3 core principles that we've always relied on. First is the principle of security. We don't build back doors in our products. Why? It's the wrong thing to do for customers. It's also economic suicide. You put a back door in your product, you can't sell anywhere in the world, including the United States. It's very funny because actually Windows has registry keys. When you load the program, there are all these registry keys. There was a registry key that was actually, and Chris may remember this, NSA key. And I was in China, and the Chinese said to me, NSA key, this is the back door for the NSA. And I said, if we were going to put a back door in for the NSA, do you think we'd name it NSA key? And he said, that's why it's so diabolical. So we don't put back doors in our products, we don't weaken our security products, and we advance the state of security technology. We need to protect the privacy of our users. They care a lot about that. And so we give users choice, and we only turn over data when we get lawful requests for specific and identifiable accounts. And we also have a principle of transparency. So we publish transparency notices. We litigated with the government to disclose more about national security letters. And that lawsuit was recently settled, and we're now disclosing more information. And the reason, we have these core principles is we are a global business. And this kind of surveillance causes people to distrust the underlying technology. And because the internet was, of course, born in the United States, and a lot of the IT companies are centered here, and the big cloud providers, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, are centered here, losing your trust of your foreign customers is just unacceptable. And so what we have had to do, of course, is take steps to make sure we don't lose that trust. So, for example, we have announced that we're encrypting everything, as is most of the industry. By everything, I mean communications to and from Microsoft, communications between Microsoft data centers, and data at rest. Is that going to make it harder for the intelligence community to do their work? Yes. But you have to remember that on one hand, you have government that has this traditional missions. On the other hand, you have citizens who are expressing concerns about surveillance and privacy, and you have industry in the middle. And while government and citizens and the political debate goes on, and we discuss, where we want to land, what kind of structures do we want? Do we want data retention in the US like we have in the EU? While all those debates are unfolding, we are shipping product and service every day. Therefore, we have to make decisions now. Choosing not to encrypt is a decision. Choosing to encrypt is a decision. Both of these decisions have import, and you have to go. And at the end of the day, regional minds can differ on issues like bulk collection. Industry has said we don't favor bulk collection. The administration says they need bulk collection. We still have to decide what to do in our products and services, and we have to listen to the market and listen to our customers. And so that's what we're doing. Because if we don't maintain and in some ways restore this trust, then our competitiveness as a company goes down, which isn't good. The growth of global IT gets stalled, which isn't good. Economic opportunity, job growth, all the things that we've gotten from a global internet with common standards and easy usage gets impeded by national borders. It is a very hard question how you apply sovereign laws in a sovereign agnostic internet. But for global companies that build one, ship everywhere, we have to make decisions, and we're listening to our customers, and we're just building more and more security features in to give them a higher level of trust in ICT.
Thanks. Mike, your company got pulled into this debate a few months back, and yet you've had a very successful conference in San Francisco, well attended. How do you guys get beyond these sorts of accusations or innuendos?
Thanks, sir. First off, I do think that we are still seen, and we're proud to be seen as an innovative technology and services company. And part of the visibility that we've had, and I think some of the influence and it drives to the successful conference just last week, is that we have been building our structure around an intelligence-driven security. And so that leads obviously to an international community, very much like what Scott was talking about. It leads to us to be able to build once and ship everywhere. What's happened in the dialogue, though, in the last 9 months or so is looking at us as a cybersecurity company that is providing services and products and leadership that should be protecting one's privacy, whether it's government or enterprise or individuals. It's made the conversation more difficult because we're caught in the net of suspicion. That's what we have as a result of the revelations, being part of the technology sector. So it's been about making sure that we have the direct dialogue, the one-on-one dialogue, the ability to demonstrate the cybersecurity professionals' view of what we are doing and what is necessary, and how the individual organization can, in fact, own their own data and have visibility into it, and to be able to determine who has rightful access or not. Unfortunately, as part of what's been going on, there is a potential for isolationism and some other anti-competitive type of posturing that can affect the industry here. And in fact, it will affect industry around the world. We're proud to be national security and, in fact, international security partners. And I think that that's one significant aspect that may be severely affected by the conversation and some of the actions that are taken or potentially taking place either here or around the world. I'd much rather be focusing on the real threat. We've talked a little bit about that. We've definitely see in the last week what can happen with respect to real threat. And I worry about, because of the dialogue, that we have the potential to drop the ball, drop visibility on where the actual threat actors are. And frankly, whether it's criminal activity or nation-state activity, because of what's been dialoguing over the last 9 months, those are the individuals that have benefited thus far, and so need to be aware of that. What I really like to be able to do is what we've all talked about, is to be able to rebuild trust inside. And this is where it's not just about what the actions of the U.S. government or other governments need to take. It's what we as an industry need to take place. Scott mentioned a few, but I think that as an industry, we have to actually be much more proactive in the way we work with standards bodies, in the way we have the transparency on our own side. I do believe that U.S. government in particular needs to have more transparency. But I'm not talking about tactics, techniques, and procedures. I'm talking about who's responsible for what, some of the chalk lines, I think, that were mentioned, and so that there's greater ability to tie who's responsible for what, and in actuality, what that consists of. And then it's been mentioned a couple times. I really think legislation is needed. It's for the benefit of industry, and it's for the benefit of the governments to be able to once again look back at where individuals have some responsibility, and to really drive, in many cases, we've heard both public-private partnerships and private-public partnerships today, but it's to operationalize it. It's to make it effective, to not just the sharing of information, but making sure that there is the situational awareness and the ability to act against the real threats that are out there.
Thank you very much. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions from you all, but there are a couple of threads that come to my mind based upon the conversation here. So let me begin. We'll do a bit of a discussion here, but again, please let me know so we have plenty of time to get questions from the audience. Chris and Mike, Scott brought up the whole question of encryption and what Microsoft and a lot of other actors are now doing with regard to encryption. Chris, I know in our time together at Fort Meade, we know that the question of equities, all right, I mean, what do you do with regard to a vulnerability you've discovered? That question's been with NSA since 1952. You always have to decide when you discover a vulnerability, do you exploit it, or do you protect the users of that product against the vulnerability? Can I ask you, Chris, a little bit to kind of talk from the offensive side, all right? In a world that's different from 52, in which the encryption you're attacking is not an isolated code book on Soviet strategic rocket forces networks, but more likely would be in generalized use. How does the offense think about that? And then, Mike, in your former DHS hat, what does the defensive side of the U.S. government think about that judgment with regard to equities?
Of course, 1952 is a far easier world. We might not have known it at the time, or those that tell me about it might not have thought so at the time. Because in those days, NSA's two-part mission were conducted in physically different places. We would essentially break codes in one place and make codes in another. Those were physically distinct nets. Our adversaries in those days made their own networks, made their own keying schemes, and we would essentially do our work there. The insidious result of the last 60 years of evolution, transformation, revolution in cyberspace has been that they're now the same network. And many of these dual-use goods are all-use goods. Everybody uses the same gear, which means that the offense, that's what NSA would call its intelligence service, as opposed to the defense, which is the information assurance component, has to defer, must necessarily defer to the equities of the defense. It's actually an inherently easier job to do intelligence gathering in cyberspace than it is to defend, because in order to succeed in an intelligence activity, you have to find the one weak seam. You have to find the one weakness in your adversary's defenses. Of course, to defend, you have to defend everything. You have to be perfect or near perfect all the time. No such thing as a secure network, but you build inherently defensible networks. You defend them 24 hours a day, and you use all the instruments of personal, corporate, and government power to defend those networks. The SIGINT side of the business, the intelligence side of the business, must lean in and help in that regard. So to the question about how then the equities proposition is teed up, NSA's signals intelligence apparatus understands that the vulnerabilities it might discover are vulnerabilities not simply to potential adversaries, but vulnerabilities to friends, U.S. and allied friends. And therefore, the predisposition is to push those across the table so that they might then be utilized to defend the whole. On average, in excess of 90% of what NSA would discover through classified means and methods ultimately finds its way to those who then secure, fix those vulnerabilities.
Okay. Mike?
So from a DHS, from a defensive posture, I think I'll just start with the fact that it rests on trust. And there are several folks that are in here when DHS built the organization to be able to take advantage of whether it's intelligence that identified vulnerabilities or individual departments and agencies on the U.S. government side or from the private sector to be able to quickly respond. So speed became paramount. If you connect trust to speed, that meant that you now had to ensure that the private sector was there present in a classified space to be able to have the right situational awareness and the ability to take the actions that were required, whether it was the simple identification of the vulnerability, the development of the mitigation plans that needed to be put in place for those vulnerabilities, as well as, once again, that situational awareness. So it goes back to trust and speed. And that's what I think is what we're continuing to build on, what I think the private sector, my engagement now from a private sector perspective into the U.S. government, as well as partnering within the sector itself, is still about trust and speed, making sure that those equities that we talk about include the private sector equities. And in fact, the process that was put in place in the interagency called for that ability. And the way DHS was able to articulate those private sector equities was through the NKIC and the process that was established there.
Thank you. Scott, you said something that intrigued me, and I don't know if you can say more about, not because it's classified, but there may not be much more to say. But you reflect on the fact that Microsoft is a supranational organization, right? And yet all your interlocutors are nation states with perhaps a more narrow view of this than you have. You want to talk a little bit about the dynamic and what that means, and will it get better?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. You know, one of our security principles is we don't do offense, just defense. And one of the reasons for that is when governments engage in offensive activity, we have one customer attacking another. And actually, the attack customer is going to call us for help. And, you know, our goal, like with any customer, is to be a trusted advisor to that customer. And, you know, for a host of reasons, because it's not just about, you know, licensing the product. Most actually successful exploits aren't based on vulnerabilities in code, but misconfigurations of systems. And, you know, systems are hard to manage and configure. They've been getting easier over time, on one hand, because the tools have gotten better, and harder because the environment's gotten more complex. So we need fairly deep relationships with our customers, and we have a fairly extensive consulting services everywhere we do business. And so, you know, to some extent, we're always a little bit of this, people recognize that we're incorporated in the U.S. We have, you know, until very recently, we had U.S. CEOs. We have board of directors here, SEC filings, and it took a long time to build up trust around the world. And actually, one of the ways we did it, and I think the only way you can do it, is through transparency. So over 10 years ago, we started sharing our source code with governments. And the reason for that was governments were saying, how can we run Windows in our military, in our banking systems, in our, well, they didn't use this term back then, but our critical infrastructures, when it may have backdoors for the US government? We said, fine, you can see our code. And we've made our code available to governments for over a decade, and we recently announced we're even expanding the program with regional transparency centers where countries can come in, not only review the code, which they've had the ability to do for a long time, but even run tools against the code to look for backdoors, vulnerabilities, and other things. So the key is, you know, to have trust, you have to be transparent. And so we make these things available to government customers because they inherently and naturally worry about the risk of relying on a supply chain that is not their own. It's really important to understand this too, that, you know, if you look at an average PC, it is not, you know, sourced in any one country. It is a composites of parts. There'll be parts manufactured in China, there'll be parts manufactured in Japan, there'll be parts manufactured in Europe, there'll be parts manufactured in the US. And so you have all these countries around the world dependent on a global supply chain, but they only want to trust the stuff that came from their own country, right? As if you could trust your own people all the time, which of course we know you can't. And so being transparent is really critical, and then building, you know, close relationships with customers.
Thank you. Haley, you sound somewhat optimistic that we would get to the convergence in transatlantic discussions with regard to values of privacy and transparency. Let me be a contrarian a bit and talk me out of it, all right? Certainly when I was at NSA, we viewed privacy to be something almost exclusively as the product of the Fourth Amendment and the protection of American sovereignty to U.S. persons. Now, before Chris jumps in, I mean, we were not there for prurient interest and so on, and didn't do anything that wasn't operationally relevant. So it's not like, this was a wholesale massive surveillance. But there was a clear distinction. Are you or are you not protected by the Fourth Amendment? And once you decided that, then your toolkit looked very, very different. The European view, I know, is different. The European view is this broader, more generalized human right to privacy, and isn't the product of your citizenship of one particular state or another. So how do we get to the merge with those kinds of backgrounds?
I think one of the points that I just outlined amongst those 5 whatever action items that we should now work on with our US partners is exactly the ongoing review process by extending safeguards available to US citizens, also to EU citizens who are not resident in the US. And I think this is one of the action items that we should work on. If we want to have the global trade partnership or the transatlantic trade partnership, we set the global norms now on these issues. We actually, how many people we have now? 800 million people. We set global norms here, and therefore I think this is an opportunity to make it right. And EU possibly is not going to change its current frameworks too much, but as you said, it's much broader. So, and it allows more flexibility. And therefore, I'm still optimistic.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then if you've got questions, please get ready to articulate them. Chris, I'm going back to you. Really early on, you talked about your triad of necessity and proportionality, which are broadly agreed principles across the Atlantic. You talked about transparency, and you talked about consent of the governed. You brought that point up. It's something that's occurred to me. You've had consent of the governors. You had 2 houses of Congress, multiple times, bipartisan, 2 incredibly different presidents, the American court system. That's all 3 branches. That's kind of the Madisonian trifecta. And getting all those to kind of check off on this was the great compromise, and it was the compromise of the 1970s, that this would no longer be housed only within the executive branch and thereby trusting on the goodwill of the sovereign, so to speak. And now there's a broad view about the land that even though all 3 branches of government checked off on it, it's still not legitimately consent of the governed because, well, you didn't tell me. How are you going to work in that environment in the future?
I thought that was a rhetorical question for a minute there. If you'd asked me in May of 2013, I would have said just that, which is that in a representative democracy, we have the consent of the governed because those who stand in their shoes have essentially combined 3 branches of government to construct the programs that have been so much pilloried across the time since. And that if there was a conspiracy afoot, Madison would call that government. He would say that all 3 branches of the government conspired to do it just this way with all of the protocols and protections laid in. But given that we've been chasing this story for the last 9 months, a story not often constructed against what the bare facts would actually tell you, a story based upon an interpretation of blueprints, not an interpretation of the controls, the purposes that are laid on top of those through vehicles that are in the public domain but not much storied. I think that we necessarily have to take this story beyond those who stand in the shoes of the governed to those who essentially have come to a false conclusion about the basis of these programs and win back their understanding and hopefully their confidence about this, so that they might in turn to those who govern on their behalf say, I'm comfortable with this. You should be equally comfortable with this. I think that extending that to what Heli talks about, which is to our partners, our allies, who suffer the same threats, aspirations, opportunities in the world that we do, we have an obligation to have that dialogue with them too. I wouldn't have said it quite so plainly or clearly before June of 2013, but we're in a different place.
Okay, thank you. Sir.
Mark Seiden. Scott, a quick question. Would you ever use Windows Update to distribute software on behalf of a government agency or someone who required a quick patch to be downloaded to some machine, or would that you consider that to be a violation of trust? Because you're in a very central position, you know, with people applying automatically Windows Update on a billion machines.
The answer is no, we would not do that. And in fact, recently we got a letter from a bunch of concerned citizens in Europe asking, we have an antivirus product called Defender. It alerts you if there's malware. They asked us whether we had ever tweaked Defender to not alert if we found government surveillance software. And our response to them was, we actually don't care where the source is or the purpose. If it's malware, we notify. Okay. And so no, we would not do that.
So it's refreshing to hear your position on this. RSA has not been exactly transparent in their descriptions of what they do. It was a surprise to many people that they kept the seed values for all those tokens, which were compromised a number of years ago. Do you still retain those seed values for the convenience of the customers?
In fact, we do maintain the seed values for some of the customers that, in fact, desire to have it. It's part of the contractual responsibilities that they have.
Is that an opt-out kind of situation?
It is.
Is it by default that you retain it, or by default that you don't retain it?
I don't know that part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Hello, Mike Best. I'm grateful that the five of you could be here and address us. We've been throwing around the word privacy a lot in this panel and other panels, and luncheon number 2, that was all we talked about, basically. The word privacy has always been an extremely murky one. My understanding of the current interpretation of constitutional law is that there is no basis for the right to privacy in the Constitution, either in the 4th or 5th Amendments. And that this is borne out basically by the current case law, because it is such an ambiguous term. Do you think that it might benefit the public debate and attempts to find solutions where we balance civil rights against the needs of security if we framed it in terms of a freedom from intrusion or a lack of intrusion rather than a right to privacy? The freedom from intrusion does have basis in the 4th and 5th Amendments, and it's mirrored in current case law for investigations, medical purposes, et cetera. So I'm curious what the five of you would think about addressing the problem from that angle instead of right to privacy.
I'll start. Okay. I got a question somewhat like this at a conference in Vancouver, or actually Victoria, British Columbia, about 13 months ago, and I gave. So what do you mean by privacy? And this was a conference on privacy, and I was the former director of NSA, so it was kind of a 1v-many engagement. I said privacy is the line that we continually negotiate between ourselves as unique creatures of God and ourselves necessarily as social animals. All right, and so neither of those realities are absolute, and that it is a negotiated line. And what is the appropriate location of that line has to depend upon the totality of circumstances in which you find that. So what it is I'm allowed to hold, and the government has no legitimacy to intrude, to extract, is something that's frankly negotiated and negotiable, because I just don't see any permanence in it. I mean, Chris will vouch. The afternoon of 9/11, well, we changed minimization procedures at NSA, and that was based upon the totality of the circumstances available.
I agree that it is a constantly shifting line. Part of the reason why I think freedom from intrusion may be better than right to privacy is because when the public hears it, they think right to privacy is somehow equivalent with the right to free speech, that it is virtually absolute, that it is a fixed line, that they have this invisible shell around them and their computers and everything that they do, when in reality that's not a reasonable expectation from either society or the government.
I agree that transparency, privacy, free speech, all get kind of mixed up into a bit of an omelet every time we talk, but let the folks on the panel offer their views.
I largely agree that you've got the germ of a great idea. The unfortunate truth, though, is at the end of the day, this is subjective, right? Different societies and within societies, different groups come to different conclusions about what, to what degree there is a right to a lack of intrusion or prevention of government intrusion, and you pick the artifact. The Europeans and the United States have different interpretations about the right to kind of privacy vis-a-vis metadata. There are different interpretations within the United States about whether a single kind of collective metadata, Smith versus Maryland, or the kind of gross aggregate collection of metadata, think 215, whether one or the other of those is perhaps on the wrong side of the line. And so I think precision in the artifacts in our conversation would be very helpful. So being very precise about what does the Constitution actually say, right? Unreasonable search and seizure, Fourth Amendment. But we're ultimately going to have to come to some subjective decisions, and that's then where the word privacy comes in, because that's really a subjective matter based upon the totality of circumstances.
Kelly?
Well, when it comes to Fourth and Fifth Amendments, I am not an expert, really. So, also.
Scott?
So actually, I wouldn't just limit it to the definition you posited. There are multiple definitions if you look through the historical literature. Part of it is the right to be left alone, Justice Brandeis's famous definition there, but the penumbras of the amendments, as the Supreme Court has mentioned. But there's also the question of informational privacy, which is somewhat different. And it's important to have a broad definition because it's not just, although this panel's been a lot about government surveillance, industry has a lot of data too. And you share a lot of data within individuals. As Alan Weston, the professor from Columbia, said 4 decades ago, informational privacy is the right of people to decide for themselves what they want to share with whom and for what purpose. And I think, trying to just focus on intrusion would be unduly limited. There are, some formulations about zones of privacy, private facts. There's, actually multiple definitions, and it depends what harm you're trying to address.
Do you think that that customers, to some degree, opt out from privacy concerns when they do business with companies like Verizon, where you have things like transactional records, where thousands of strangers have theoretical access to it? Those are people voluntarily choosing to engage in programs where, okay, because I talk on the phone, it is possible for someone to listen in. Or it is possible for them to gather.
Don't forget about context, though. So we've had a wiretapping statute in the United States since 1968. And actually, if you talk to most people, if they talk about listening in on their phone calls, most people would tell you, my expectation, my reasonable expectation is that my phone calls are private. Now, the Supreme Court decided years and years ago, Smith v. Maryland, that if you, turn over data to a third party, like the numbers you dial, you lose your constitutional expectation of privacy. Right. Leaving aside the concurrence opinion of Justice Sotomayor in U.S. v. Jones, questioning whether in a world of cloud you should waive your expectation of privacy by giving data to a third party. Don't confuse constitutional rights of privacy with customer expectations of privacy. People have expectations of privacy that often exceed their constitutional rights. And as a vendor of product and as a collector of data with terms and conditions, our customers have expectations about notice and choice, and that we'll use the data in certain ways, and where they'll be opt-in versus opt-out, when notice will be discoverable versus prominent. There are kind of social norms around these things.
What do you think about when people's expectations aren't based on reality? Just because someone expects something, I expect to win the lottery. That doesn't mean that the state has to give me $1 million because I had an expectation of it.
No, but I would educate you by showing the odds.
Fair enough.
And I think it is a fair comment. Sometimes if you go back to cell phones, if you remember in the early years of cell phones, people thought their cell phone calls were private. But in fact, because they went over the wireless connections unencrypted, they could easily be intercepted. And there was a mismatch between people's expectations and what was really happening. You could buy a scanner for very low money, and then Congress updated the laws to match societal expectations. Remember, ECPA, the Privacy Communications Act, is not the Omnibus Act of '68 was required by the Supreme Court when they struck down wiretapping without a statutory construct. But having said that, the privacy rights that we all have come to expect here based on ECPA are statutory.
Right.
And so, you do have to educate users about what expectations are reasonable or not and have that discussion. And then if people don't think that their reasonable expectations are being met, then you start looking at, okay, how do we change that either through technology or law?
Okay, thank you. Next, please.
I was hoping to hear from the Admiral.
Mike, did you have anything to add?
My answer would have been basically the same as Scott and Chris's. In what we do is try to educate and give the flexibility and the agility for whoever the organization is to be able to comply with either government or policies that the organization's put in place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir.
When I was doing the International Financial Transaction Standard, I was backed into doing strong authentication because of the EU DPD directive instead of identification. When I was doing the US Financial Privacy Standard, I found most people in the US horribly confused between authentication and identification. And it was a really difficult problem with government and institutions and other places trying to say, I can prevent fraud with strong authentication, I don't need identification. The one exception was in dealing with health in the federal government, the PII standard had an implication that I could leak PII information from the metadata in financial statements. And so there was a very special case that had to be done in the privacy standard to handle PII health under HIPAA leaking out just from the metadata. But the underlying problem I found in the US was a huge confusion between identification and authentication, which I didn't find in the EU. EU was very, very strong on identification, was something that was distinct from authentication.
Comment?
Throw in non-repudiation for the trifecta.
Yes.
I didn't mean to confuse the issue.
No, I've probably written more email to the agency on non-repudiation than I have on identification.
Thank you.
Well aimed.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. Pei Ran Wang from the Free University of Brussels, Belgium. My question is, Snowden make to some extent make Chinese, whether the academic or the policymaker, believe, oh, the United States has not a moral advantage on the cyber security and the cyber regime building. Then, for to present, Chinese always under the criticism that, for example, the blocked internet. And certainly the international regime on the cyberspace is required. And how to make Beijing believe it's the transparency and the other principle can be trusted for the is equal to all of the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to direct your question and its elements to different people on the panel. Chris, I'm going to come to you in a second and say, so are you just like PLA 3 or not? Okay. No. Well, I want you to elaborate, and then maybe Scott and Mike. So we have a different view of the World Wide Web than, say, the Chinese do. How do international companies actually enjoy a vantage point to try to narrow those differences? So,
Yeah, so first, there is a distinction, but it's a nuanced distinction and often lost in the conversation. The United States has been pushing very hard for a red line being that an intelligence service of the kind NSA or the PLA-3 might be should not engage in economic intelligence. That is, to take intelligence and provide that to private sector or quasi-private sector entities for their financial benefit so that they might better compete with whatever is sitting across the table or across the world from them. The United States does not engage in that. We've declared that as a red line, and I think that we should be then held accountable to that. I think that private diplomacy is where we're probably going to make that case to the Chinese as opposed to kind of a trade of emphatic assertions. But I think you need to start with what are those red lines, what are the chalk lines I described earlier, and then be able to backstop those with some degree of transparency in the public domain and some degree of candor in the private negotiations.
I think there is an important distinction, although they're related, between values and norms. So countries, individuals, companies have values, and they often try to promote them. We promote free speech. We're part of the Global Network Initiative, and we push back on governments that try to censor free speech. And at an international level, we support norms, because the more that countries can agree on what normative behavior should be, the easier it is to be a global business. The fact that countries sometimes disagree on norms doesn't mean they disagree on everything. And so countries can sometimes have difficult conversations about freedom of speech and certain rights, but at the same time engaged in trade and military exercises and other things in areas where they actually have agreement. And for Microsoft, it's about remaining true to our values and doing businesses in ways that are not contrary to those values.
Mike?
Building off of what Scott just said, my experience is that you've got the range of countries that are looking for some of the same procedures, some of the same norms that Scott mentioned about, but may not have the same structure or authorities that we have, and that comes with pluses and minuses. And so they're looking for the best practices, and they're looking to be able to take advantage of either the infrastructure that they do have, it may be a single internet service provider or none, and try to come up with the appropriate norms and behaviors to build around what their particular situation has provided them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kelly, can I just ask one question? It's sort of a follow-on, but perhaps 10 degrees off center line. One of the recommendations of the commission that President Obama launched with Mike Morrell and Richard Clark and others, one of them was to better organize within the United States government with regard to cyber issues, and to actually create, and I don't know if they used the word Assistant Secretary of State for cyber domain, but the general thought process was that. When the European Union talks to America about these questions, who are they talking to? I mean, let me talk as an American here and then ask for your views as a European. I mean, the strongest player in American cyber thought in the government is the Department of Defense, right? It's not the Department of Commerce. It's not the Department of Justice. It's not the President's scientific advisor. The seminal American article on all this was Bill Lynn's article about three and a half years ago, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So when you talk to the United States, who do you think your interlocutors are? And who do they represent? And do they come at you in a balanced or not so balanced sort of way? We're among friends. Go ahead and be candid.
I will give you a typical response that we use in our EU landscape, so prepare for 10 minutes. Well, the European Union is not a federal state. This is a supranational international organization to which some of the powers have been delegated by the sovereign countries, the member states of the European Union. And as it happens, one of those competencies that European Union as a supranational international organization, political science terms, has is data protection, whereas national security is something that member states still own, and EU does not have any competence in national security. So when it comes to national security issues, then the US counterparts would speak with the member states separately. So US versus all the 28, if you wish. So then, if it's a data protection issue or privacy issue, then this will be done under the Justice and Home Affairs, which would be the equivalent of your Department of Justice, I believe. And for the EU, it would be the Ministers of Justice, and it would be the EU Commissioner for Justice, currently Viviane Reding. So this is done within this framework. And for instance, if we talk about diplomatic cyber issues, then I see Chris standing there. Then my organization talks to Chris. So it depends on the issue area, because EU is a huge organization with certain competencies delegated to the European level and certain competencies still at the national level. So I'm not bothering you with the, how EU is built up, otherwise we spend the whole day here. So, but this is a short answer.
That seems well designed to get us to an integrated solution sooner or later. Sir, I think you got the honor of the last question.
Thank you, Scott. A quick question. Since you've opened up the source code for Windows to governments, some of which have been accused of hacking and zero-day development, have you noticed any uptick in zero-day exploitation coming from any of those governments?
So the problem is one of causation. So when we open up our source code to government, the contract requires them to report vulnerabilities so we can fix them. And you actually don't need source code to find vulnerabilities.
But
I think, you know, a little, we have found, so we run the security development lifecycle and we try to reduce vulnerabilities in code for the last decade with some degree of success. And tooling is far more important than code reviews. But having said that, you do see an uptick in 0 days, but the tools are getting better. There are more sophisticated adversaries spending more resources on it. So showing causation would be really hard, I think.
Well, thank you all for your attention. Let me thank the panel. I certainly learned a great deal in the last 90 minutes, and I trust the same holds true for you. So thank you all very much.